Hello, everyone. Again, this is Greg Aden with Aden Leadership, and today I have a special guest, Choi, who is the Senior Vice President at FirstBank, but his actual role there is Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, also known as DEI. Sean, good morning. Thank you for being with us. And how are you today? Let's start out with
Yeah,
the easy
Greg.
question.
Yeah, Greg. Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing really good. It's a Tuesday. It's a beautiful day and not too hot. So just easing into the morning. So yeah.
Beautiful. Well, let's start out with letting the listeners and the audience know how did you decide to get to First Bank? What was your journey to getting to that organization?
Oh yeah. I depends on how far back you want to go, Greg, and how much detail you want.
Uh, how
But
about after high school, but before today?
yeah, sure. So um, after high school, so I am a Colorado native, and I am the first in my family to graduate from high school, let alone go to college.
Hmm.
I think that's important. I know you said high school, but I'm a son of Korean American immigrants. My parents came here and immigrated from Korea. After high school, I grew up in Colorado Springs. After high school, I went to CU Boulder, where I was actually a political science major. Studied politics to learn. I want nothing to do with it, but by that time, it was a little too late. But I did some interesting things in college. I managed a college radio station. So there I got exposed to a lot of different cultures. It's kind of an experimental college radio station. If anyone knows anything about college radio, it's very anti-mainstream. So
Mhm.
got exposed to a lot of different thoughts, ideas, and cultures. Really, really great time in my life. Afterwards, I actually worked in music for a little bit, working for some corporations like Red Bull, throwing events and concerts and doing a little bit of traveling through music. But realized as I was getting older that I needed to um, kind of figure out my career plans. And I did always like kind of business. I managed, like I said, the college radio station. I
Mhm.
also helped my dad's friend manage a construction company, kind of in their back end offices. So when it came time to go back to school, I thought about going back to school to get a graduate degree, and I ended up majoring in finance. Because one of the many things I thought about was if I'm going to go into debt to learn something, it is going to be money because I knew nothing about money. It's kind of funny, but those are things that when you're the first person in your family, let alone friends, to go to college, and you don't have a lot of guidance. I didn't have a lot of people to ask about, hey, what did you do, or what did you study in
Mhm.
school, or you know,
Sure.
and so really, that logic of wanting to study money. I mean, that really comes out of not having a lot of resources, not knowing a lot of people that went to get a graduate degree, let alone graduate from high school. The one thing I did remember when I was going to graduate school was that I didn't take advantage of career opportunities when I was in undergrad.
Okay.
So I realized quickly that I need to go to these career fairs. I need to talk to an advisor. I didn't take advantage of a lot of those resources that college students have. So I did that when I was getting my graduate degree. Ended up going to a couple career fairs, and then I met um, who at the time was recruiting for First Bank, a diversity internship program. Because First Bank was smart enough to figure out in the early 2010s that they lacked some diversity, and that it was important to them. So even back then, it was important to them. And so I actually applied to be a part of this internship program as a 26-year-old intern when everyone else was 20, 21. But the other reason was paid.
Yeah.
And frankly, if I was gonna leave my job at the time to do this internship, it had to be paid. So yeah, and
Yeah, I was
so
going to say, let me comment on the if you know anything about college radio station. I do actually. I was a DJ when I was in college. I helped build
I remember
the
you telling me
sports.
that. Yeah.
This, yeah, when we first met, and it's interesting whether it's music or being on the radio. When it sounded like you had an interest in communicating with other people in a unique way. I mean, not everybody wants to be on radio or much less TV. And then I also want to recognize you for maybe not breaking the mold in your family because it didn't sound like there was one. You actually created a new way of looking at the value of education. And so everybody that's been in your life, Sean, I can't speak for them, but I can imagine that they're saying thank you. Thank you for being brave and doing something different. and getting not only a great education, but coming into what a great organization. And not missed on me was your comment. First Bank was smart enough to value diversity, equity, and inclusion. So tell us what you did when you first came to the bank, because I know you were working for a particular market. And then what was it like when you were selected to not only be in charge of, but run the entire DEI program for First Bank?
I'll start off with saying that I never would have thought I'd be a banker. I talk about this all the time, but the idea of working in a bank was not appealing to me at the time. But again, it was an internship. It was paid. What really helped was the recruiter was around my age, someone I could relate to, and that really helped too. I think it made me feel comfortable that okay, maybe they are looking for someone like me, and so that really helped. But again, I had never worn a suit. My former boss actually had to show me how to tie a tie. Was very uncomfortable going. Never had worked in a big corporation or anything like that. Always small businesses. So there was a little bit of anxiety around that. But what really helped is my original team that I started out with was really great about including me, making me feel like I belong, and really helped me feel like I could be myself. And of course, I was the only person of color. They actually stuck me in Centennial, which is, if anyone knows Denver, it's a southern suburb of Denver. I'd never been to Centennial. I didn't even know it existed, right? So wasn't excited about going to Centennial, but again, that first management team really helped me feel like I belonged. And it was little things like just asking me my opinion, letting me speak during meetings, including me in the different happy hours, and just respecting me. Even though I was like an intern or like a management trainee, they really kind of took me in. And I think that really helped me. My career plan for First Bank was to only be here for 2 years, get that experiences. All the job applications say 2 years, 2 years experience. 2 years turned into 4 years turned into 6. Next thing you know, I've been here for 11 years. So
let me ask you a question. And if you want to, I'd like to bring the name or the names of the leaders that did see you, did value you, did understand you, and did include you. Who were they?
There's a lot. There's probably more names than I would want to say, but I had my original training officer, great guy named Tom Ashley. He's over at A&B Bank now, but very different than me. I grew up kind of in a city around a lot of diversity. He grew up in Salida, country guy, loved country music. I hated country music, but we got along. And there's a guy named Derek Longwell who's the president now at First Bank. But he was really great about taking me in. I remember one time he showed up even on a Saturday to help me with a project when he didn't have to. Eventually, I did transfer to our Aurora market where I spent 8 years of my career, and I absolutely loved it there because then our management team there, for whatever reason, was really diverse. I always joke about we had a little bit of everything. We had Asians, Blacks, Spanish speakers. We even had a couple redheads, like gingers. So I joke about that time because it was really a really great mix. And we got along great. And our president at the time, we started with a different president, but eventually it was Shannon Jones. And I think she just made an environment where we could be ourselves, have fun, but also hold us to really high standards. That's a great experience. And I use that as a model for diversity at our company. Because I think the Aurora market, prior to when a lot of us got there, wasn't really known for producing large volume of loans. And at our company, we're a very real estate heavy based lender. Sure. So that's important. And when we got there, we were so diverse, but we also broke records for our market in terms of loan production every year. I think the first year I got there, they were only doing like $20 million in loans. And by the time I left, I think we were nearing 200 million. And so it's just a great example of diversity working. And so I always use that as a great model. And I think a lot of people knew that here at our company too, just what our Aurora market did. So yeah, I was really proud of that. And then last year, our company, we've always had a director of diversity position, but it was always kind of focused around recruiting. But there's been a couple things in the works for many years. including creating diversity committees, having our board involved with the diversity or a board level diversity committee. And then last year, they worked on a strategic plan for our bank. It's kind of a
Mhm.
3-year strategic plan. And one of the main areas of focus is what we call Include All, which is our DEI efforts. And as part of those efforts, the decision was made that they wanted to create this director of diversity, equity, inclusion role that's not just focused around recruiting, but our employees throughout their whole life cycle, our customers and community.
Yeah.
And I think it was really great. A lot of companies had started creating these positions, within the last few years. I think for our company, it was more about putting all these other little building blocks in place and building a foundation of DEI over the last decade, and sometimes even longer than that, in order for a director of DEI to make sense.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
want to dig into the not the reason for DEI, but the value of DEI. But it's interesting. You mentioned the gentleman that's from Salida. I'm actually coming to you from Salida, Colorado today,
Yeah.
which is just weird. I mean, that stuff just happens. And then you mentioned Derek Longwell. I met him actually at the Avalanche game 2 of the
Yeah.
Stanley Cup, and I was just really taken by how intentional he was. Not only was he a gentleman and a professional, but just a real intentional communicator. And then Shannon Jones. Not everybody listening knows that the president of the Aurora market is now the president of human resources for all of FirstBank. And I bring her name up is because familiar, perhaps, um, dedicated and successful and talented, most likely. She had a choice to go out and handpick perhaps you. And I just want that to set in for a second. And how did it feel when you got the call or the email or the invite to lunch and say whatever she said? I think it's important. I believe it's important for our listeners to know that you may know someone really well, but how much do they trust you? How much do they want you to work on their team on their next step and journey? So again, without belaboring it too much, how did it feel when you got the note or the call that Shannon Jones wanted you to be on her team in this regard?
Yeah. I mean, just to back up, when I did apply, I did have to interview with our CEO directly, as well as our executive vice president HR and Shannon as well. And I think to be fair, since Shannon and I had a working relationship, I think she really kind of held back during the interview
Sure.
because she had already known me. So I think it was more me interviewing with our CEO, Jim Reuter, and our EVP of Human Resources. I prepared a lot for that interview because once I had decided that this role was a great fit for me, and there's a lot of different reasons why I felt that way. But I did a lot of preparation. I felt really good about doing the interview, but you still never know. I knew
Yeah.
that there was a number of people that applied, and I knew who some of them were, and they're fantastic people. But when I got the call, it was it was exciting, but it's also it's also scary and daunting, right?
Sure.
Because I'm literally changing careers. I was a commercial loan officer doing commercial real estate loans for 10 years. And now I'm switching over to this DEI world, the human resources world. To be fair, even though I had lived experiences, I had no prior experiences. And so it's your DEI work is hard work, right?
It is.
You're trying to um, in a lot of ways make the culture and the world a better place. And so there's going to be everything from people thinking you're moving too fast to people think you're moving too slow. It was exciting, but also very nervous. I still feel like right now I'm in a growth stage where I'm still learning, and there's still a lot to learn, and I know I'll get there at some point. But I still feel like I'm learning every day, and
Well, you
yeah,
you you said it, John, that you came from an example of where diversity was successful, and not just for sake of diverse. You had a very diverse organization in Aurora, and that example of success, I believe, would be one of the reasons they said, "Hey, he knows what a diverse team might look like. What if we diversified even more throughout the entire organization?" With real intention, not just recruiting because we need to, check certain boxes. And that's where I want to go next is how can other organizations, and again, let's take off your FirstBank hat just for a second and pretend for a minute you're speaking to thousands of people around the world and organizations who are struggling with DEI. What do you say to them about being DEI, and what is diversity and equity and inclusion? If you take all three words apart, what would you tell them? Then living and being DEI is a lot different than just having it part of your organization. And I say that because I honestly believe, Sean, that there are people out there that are just checking boxes and doing things so the optics look different. And I know you and I have had a small conversation prior to this, but I guess that's really the question. What would you tell people who you recommend that they live it and be it versus just talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think DEI is everyone's responsibility. It's not just one person or a director that's in charge of it. And the way I approach it is, or I like to explain it at the end of the day, really leadership skills. Because what we're talking about is trying to make people feel like they belong, feel comfortable, and feel supported. And those are universal things, regardless of maybe some of the deeper DEI topics. I think at the end of the day, those are very common human things that I think everyone has a responsibility for. And so I think when you approach it like that, I think it's something that's a little bit more tangible or understandable.
Mhm.
Yes, we focus on things because you know, I like to think about diversity as an iceberg. You have everything that's visible, like race and gender and diversity that's underneath the waterline that you can't see, things like religion and sexual orientation and disabilities and a lot of other things. But um, things above the waterline are visible and have a lot more history and
Sure.
systemic issues and things like that. So that's why that gets brought up a lot, and rightfully so. But when we think about diversity as a whole, I mean, everyone's diverse, right? And we're trying to make sure that whatever people have, whatever accommodation they need, whatever support that they need, that they're given that in order to be the best person they can be and to be the most successful person they can be. And I think
Yeah.
when you approach it like that, that's hopefully things that people can get behind.
Well, you had me at it's everyone's responsibility. DEI is everyone's responsibility. And love the next comment you said. It's all about leadership skills. And I would love for you to connect those two dots. Obviously, most people listening to this knows that I'm an executive coach and I consult on leadership development. This is a critical leadership topic. And so again, use your voice, use this platform to share, why as a leader do you believe it's important to think with diversity, think with equity, lead with inclusion? I mean, I know the answers are maybe straightforward, but why aren't we there yet then?
I guess leader is one of those big umbrella words that gets thrown around a lot too, and everyone has
Sure.
their different definition of leadership. But you know, I I think leaders are lifelong learners. True leaders are lifelong learners,
Amen.
um, and they're at the end of the day trying to lead a team to be the best team they can be. Right. I think things like I talked to someone not too long ago who's a leader of their organization. They were struggling with their DEI issues because he felt that no matter what he said, he wasn't saying the right things and always upsetting somebody. I told him about this idea that DEI is really a leadership topic, and I personally think that being vulnerable is a leadership skill. Um,
Mhm.
I know not every leader thinks that, but I told him that sometimes you need to be vulnerable with your team, admit that you don't know everything, and that you're okay with the criticism, and that you want to learn and grow.
Beautiful.
And I think he really took that to heart, and I think that made a lot of sense to him. Because yes, the honest reality is the DEI world is changing all the time.
Yeah.
You're not always going to do the right thing. You're not always going to say the right thing. Even myself, as a director of DEI, I quickly realized that words really matter. And I'm not always going to say the right words. And I'm still learning on my journeys. There's topics that I might be super comfortable and ready to advocate for. And there's other issues that I'm still learning about and I'm not sure and I need to know more. And so I think those are just I think some examples of why it really comes down to leadership skills and those kind of ideas.
Well, you had asked, or you had said that everyone has their definition of leadership, and I'll just share with you mine. It's specifically relative to a team or a family or an organization. And John Eads put this. John Eads wrote a book about the leadership principles, and it's all about elevating those around you. How does Choi, how does Jones, how does Derek Longwell elevate everyone around them? I believe part of it is listening, being curious, and asking questions from a diverse group of
Absolutely.
people, including everybody on the team so they can participate. Equity relative to everyone has an opportunity. And it doesn't need to get more difficult than how would you like to be led? How would you like to be elevated? And would you like to be ignored? Would you not like to be included? I mean, seriously, treat those around you like they want to be treated. And you can't treat or lead someone unless you find out, how may I serve you? How do you want to be led? And yeah, yes, we have rules within organization, but unless we're more curious. And by the way, vulnerability. If you haven't heard out there, there's this person from Houston, Texas. She's very well known, called Brene Brown. And she made vulnerability, I know you have,
Yeah.
but she made vulnerability not sexy, not powerful, but just easy to understand, and connecting vulnerability to courage. I have the courage and the interest, and I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to ask you questions. And you said it earlier that we don't always have the right answers. We don't, as leaders, we don't always have an answer, but it's okay to raise our hand and say, hey, team, what should we do?
Mhm.
That's powerful. So, um, what else would you like to share with our audience as we wrap this up, and around your, maybe your struggle as a leader of DEI with First Bank, or something that most recently you're really proud of, maybe a breakthrough, or maybe one of each? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one thing this is kind of a newer, not idea, but newer thing I've been talking about within the DEI work that I'm learning. So this is just where I'm at in my journey. But is this idea of individualization?
Hmm.
With DEI work, we're learning so many things about broad topics. Whether it's about different races or cultures or things like stereotypes, microaggressions, all these things. And the world of DEI is changing. But I think also at the same time, it really comes down to the individual and what an individual person prefers. Um, a great example is for some people, there are certain words that are triggering for some people, but for others, they're not. We had a great discussion here at work about the word minority. And I know in a lot of DEI circles, they're trying to get away from the word minority. But I had a coworker who was really offended by that because um, the individual felt like just changing a word doesn't erase the history of discrimination, the things she has to face. So um, she was a proponent of using the word minority because that's where society places her. Now, whether you agree or not, or whatever, that's her individual preference, and that's so I respect that, and that's kind of I could respect that, and that's kind of where we kind of left it. Um, but it's just an example. Other examples are like within the Latinx communities, a lot of people don't love the word Latinx, right? A lot of groups don't love the word Hispanic. Some people want to go by the country that they're from. Some people are okay with just being called Latino or Latina. And so, like, I think that's one of the hard things is people try to come talk to me about, like, well, how should we deal with this community, or how should we deal with this group? And I think at the end of the day, it's about some of those leadership skills, about talking, communicating, and knowing what the individual prefers as a way to you know, support someone on your team. So I think that's kind of a newer thing
Yeah,
that I'm kind of working through and talking through. So I apologize if it doesn't sound all perfect, but that's just I'm
that's
learning a
beautiful.
lot more about that. Yeah.
Well, and I hear you, Sean. And my response, not so much on the minority conversation, because I mean, there could be minority partnerships. They could be minorities in color. There can be minorities in thinking. But individualism is, I believe in that. I hear you, and I can see why you value it. My ask is that we, like you just said, consider your individualism within the context of the team. Because when you start to put I before we, you might be a minority, period. And your vision or version of yourself that is now making a better team, you're going to be viewed as, why does he or she or they not see that he, she are not any better than anyone else on the team? So
Yeah.
and again, that's, you can say there's some generations that are struggling with that. There can be some whatever that are struggling with that. I believe if we could try and change what we see instead of judge what we see and believe in what we see, and stop worrying about how we look, try and think about where the other person is coming from, and introducing the word empathy and compassion and humility. And
Yeah.
I'll leave you with that question. Where do those three words fit in your heart, Sean? And as you go through the day-to-day opportunities and or struggles of your role as Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion with FirstBank, how do you see where people struggle with empathy, humility, and compassion?
Yeah. So to speak to the challenges, you know, I in a corporate setting, I think with DEI work, the biggest challenge is always employee engagement, right? We talked about
Mm,
how DEI is the responsibility of all. I truly do believe that. But how do you get all to care about DEI, right? Or
yeah,
engage with it? People have their jobs, people have families, interests outside of work. They have all these other things. People are going 100 miles a minute. We're coming out of pandemic. How do you reach an employee and get them to be involved, care, help out with efforts? So
sure.
I think that's always the biggest challenge. And we can go on. That could probably be a whole separate podcast.
Yeah,
Um, but I do think empathy and humility and all those things, that is how you, I think that's the most important piece of DEI in terms of trying to connect with someone. A great thing that I've been kind of realizing is that, everybody has a story. I'm a big believer in that. Everybody
yeah,
has a story. And it's when you understand those stories, um, and you can tell other people's story. I think that's kind of the goal of DEI work too, is like really to understand people's story, let people tell their story, and let those stories be authentic.
absolutely.
And you can't really do that without having a lot of empathy, or having humility to be able to tell sometimes your stories, because sometimes people's stories can be, tragic and ugly, but also beautiful and funny.
Yeah.
And so it takes a little bit of bravery to, sometimes even tell your story. I have a story too. I told a little bit of it today, but even my full story, I still get nervous about telling all the time to people. So
Yeah. Well, I believe the most beautiful part of someone's story is why. Why do you do what you do? And that allows the listener to that actually be curious, have empathy and humility around and compassion. Frankly, where is this person coming from? Well, we can be judgmental and say, well, how did he get this job? How did they get this job? How did she? But let's figure out what their why is. And as they tell their story, like you did, where you were coming from, your interest in this role may not have been as unique as you thought it was until you started to really figure out who you were and what was important to you. And I loved what you said earlier, is that if I'm going to go into debt, I might as well understand money. I mean, money plays a role in almost everything we do, and it's just one of those things. Unless you live in an interesting country where money isn't as important, but being happy and fulfilled and is obviously never going to go away. But Sean, Choi, thank you for sharing some time with us today. And if you didn't hear from the very beginning, Sean Choi, Senior Vice President at FirstBank, his role there is Director of DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And any parting words, Sean? And then I'll wrap it up.
no, I just, I love Ted Lasso,
Yeah.
and I love his quote about, be curious, not judgmental. And I
Amen.
think that's really important as well in DEI work. So I really appreciate the opportunity, Greg, and I'm happy to connect. And I look forward to be part of your development series too.
Yeah, don't I won't let you go without saying that again. Sean and two others, Monica Williams and Dr. Monica Mallet, are going to be leading a conversation on Thursday, August 11th. If you're in Denver, it'll be live at the Buffalo Rose, downtown Golden. If you're around the world wanting to tune in, it'll be 9 a.m. to 12:15 Mountain Standard Time. So again, thank you for listening. This is Greg Aden. My guest has been Sean Choi. Go out and be curious. Leave the judgment where it belongs. That's in the trash can. Show up with a heart of compassion and empathy and humility. And frankly, be curious. Ask somebody something that you don't know and see what you might find out. And then tell them thank you. Thank you for telling their story. Sean Choi, have a great day. Have a great rest of the week. And to those of you listening, thank you for tuning in. And this is Greg Aden with Aden Leadership. Goodbye and God bless.